With us entering the season of all that is spooky, I had a couple of ideas when it came to reviewing some creepy games for the holiday. I've still got one or two video ideas I'd like to put out before the end of the month, but ultimately, for the first one of the season, I chose to take a walk down memory lane with Dementium The Ward Remastered for Nintendo Switch. Now we'll be covering the remaster here in this review, but I actually grew up playing the original on the Nintendo DS back in the day, and the fact that we're almost 20 years out from this game's original release date is, it's making me feel really old, not gonna lie. But despite not playing this game in over a decade, I remember a surprising amount of it. Besides the general look of the game, I remember the few bosses there were as well. That being said, some of the memories I have with playing Dementium are good, some are questionable, and some are downright diabolical. Will the experience end up being euphoric and nostalgic, or would a lobotomy be a better use of my time? This is Dementium The Ward Remastered for Nintendo Switch. Oh, and spoilers ahead for most of this game. I'm going to be showing gameplay and talking about most of what Dementium has to offer, so just consider this your warning. Though I won't be showing the final boss fight or talking about the ending, so if you're worried about that, fret not, I'm not going to talk about that here. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. Dementium The Ward's development is quite an interesting tale. Created by game developer Renegade Kid, the title was originally pitched as a Silent Hill game, believe it or not. Renegade Kid actually had a meeting with Konami, the IP holder of Silent Hill, early on in the game's development, where it would ultimately end up being rejected. Deciding that what they had was too good to cancel, Renegade Kid continued development as an original title that would eventually release on the Nintendo DS in 2007. For the time, it was a groundbreaking title that really pushed the boundaries of what a survival horror first-person shooter could be on the Nintendo handheld. In that regard, Dementium really sticks out among the Nintendo DS library when looking at the original release. And I'm not alone in that assessment, as several notable video game websites like IGN and Destructoid ended up giving the game an 8 and 8.5 respectively back in 2007. It seems the sites who enjoyed their time with Dementium often brought up how innovative it was for a DS title, and it's one I tend to still agree with when looking at the original release. Though there were a handful of video game outlets that did give the game a lower score even back in 2007, such as Game Informer, who gave it a 5.75 out of 10. But since we're looking at the remaster developed by a toy, we're no longer in the year 2007, for better and for worse. How does this game hold up by today's standards? Well, before I ultimately answer that question, let's first go over the general gameplay of Dementium The Ward, as well as the setup for the narrative. As previously mentioned, Dementium is a survival horror first-person shooter set largely in an abandoned hospital, overrun with all sorts of nightmarish monsters. Our main character experiences a brief nightmare before waking up in a hospital bed. Pretty much from the get-go, we know something truly terrible has befallen the hospital, as bloodstains and bodies are scattered just outside of the room that we woke up in. What's happened and why you're here isn't really explained from the start, but within the first 10 minutes of the game, you come across a newspaper article describing a husband murdering his wife. Not too long after that, you walk into a bathroom with this written on the mirrors in blood. Yeah, Dementium is not subtle at all when it comes to its storytelling. In fact, Dementium's story is used more for background scenery and shock value during cutscenes rather than ever being the main focus. My main problem with Dementium's story is that for how minimal it is, what's there isn't really that interesting, and the setup of the wife being murdered is never fully fleshed out or expanded upon in any meaningful way. It also doesn't help that the player character is a silent protagonist and there's virtually no side characters to pick up the slack. What this means is that not only is the narrative dull, but there's no emotion or stakes behind it from anyone's point of view. Games like System Shock 2 and Half-Life rely on other characters to drive the narrative forward and give depth to the world itself. But Dementium only has the bare bones of a plot holding it together since there's no meaningful side characters. And since the foundation of the game's narrative, that is, the murder I mentioned earlier, never really goes anywhere or is expanded upon, what you're left with is a story I didn't care about at all, I'm sorry to say. And while I won't spoil it here, the game sort of just ends unexpectedly without much resolution or resolve. Pretty disappointing. So the story is lackluster, but what about the gameplay? Well, typical gameplay of Dementium consists of you traversing through the desecrated medical complex, scavenging for resources including pills which you use to recover your health, keys to unlock more sections of the facility, notes, and ammo for your weapons that you collect over the game's runtime. There's also a small selection of puzzles throughout Dementium that'll need to be solved, and while they were nothing too complex or difficult, I didn't mind them, and they at least mixed up the gameplay a bit. I'd rather have simple, easy puzzles than difficult or obtuse ones that almost require a guide to complete, so I don't have any real complaints in that aspect. While doing all these things, however, you're also dealing with various monstrosities that roam the facility looking to add you to their corpse collection. How do you deal with said monstrosities? By blasting them to their grave with a couple of different firearms, of course. Oh, and a nightstick. Speaking of which, the weapon selection in Dementium is pretty weak overall. It mostly just consists of your typical first-person weapon arsenal. In fact, here's the full list. A nightstick, which is your basic melee weapon. A pistol, a shotgun, machine gun, sniper rifle, a revolver, and an electric buzzsaw, which I never picked up in my playthrough. That's it. That's the entire weapon selection at your disposal in Dementium. These weapons get the job done, but I'd be lying if I said most of them are satisfying to use. You also have a flashlight, and for anyone that's played vanilla Doom 3, it's handled exactly like it was in that game. What I mean by that is that the flashlight acts as a separate weapon that can't be used alongside any of the other traditional weapons I listed earlier. But unlike Doom 3, you can't use the flashlight as a melee weapon, and as a result, you won't be able to fight off enemies if your flashlight is out. Now, even back when Doom 3 released, I never really had a problem with this setup. Both games forced the player to choose between either seeing clearly what's ahead of you or being able to fight back against the monsters you come across. And with how quickly you can switch to your weapons in both games, this mechanic is something I've never really minded, and I think it's still a unique one even to this day. So yeah, the weapon selection, much like the plot, is rather weak, but at least there's a bit of variety to them. Two areas that Dementium lacks variety, however, is in its level design and enemy selection. First, let's talk about the enemies. See these humanoid enemies? Now do you see these slug creatures? Now these bugs? And finally, these enemies that crawl along the ground? Congratulations, you've just experienced 80% of the enemies in this game. I've intentionally left out one that we'll discuss in a minute, but the only other basic monsters featured in Dementium are these harder variants of a few of the enemies. There's also a couple of bosses in the game, and honestly, I have the same feelings for them as I do the puzzles. They're simple, interesting, even if just slightly, and mix up the gameplay a bit. I like the cleaver boss and the wheelchair guy armed with a machine gun the most. I mean, it's a wheelchair guy armed with a machine gun. What's not cool about that? Taking just a few more moments to discuss the combat, I had some minor issues with the hit detection. In particular, with my crosshair sometimes not locking onto targets, or the complete opposite, where my crosshair would be on an enemy, but no shot would register. Almost like the aim assist lags behind where the crosshair is on screen. This was especially noticeable with these flying head creatures. These are by far the worst enemies to fight in the game. Not only will you be struggling to aim at them properly with the poor aim assist, but they have such an insane amount of health for being such a smaller target that it'll drive you crazy on higher difficulties. The tougher version of them in later parts of the game are especially irritating. The other area Dementium lacks much variety in is in its level design. I'm sure you've noticed it in the video already, but from the moment you begin this game all the way to the second to last chapter, you'll be traversing through environments that look egregiously similar to one another. The layouts aren't 100% the same, and they do slightly switch up the wall textures here and there, but man, you can't help but notice how samey everything feels for the most part. This is why I'm extremely grateful Dementium includes a map at the press of a button. It'll save you some time from getting lost and running in circles, but it can't fix the fundamental issue this game has with its level design. Now look, it's important to remember this title was originally a DS game, so I can slightly forgive this repetitive look and feel to the level design if we were still playing this on the DS back in 2007. But we're in 2025, and we're playing this on Nintendo's current iconic handheld, the Nintendo Switch, and by today's standards, it just doesn't hold up. There are a couple of spots in the game that do break up the repetitiveness, such as when you step outside for the first time, or when you're on the roof, but these moments are few and far between. In this regard, this remaster feels like a bit of a missed opportunity by not adjusting the layout of the hospital, or by making areas feel more distinct from one another. It's yet another aspect this game falls flat in, I'm sad to say. Visually, I actually do like the look of this game, believe it or not. Yes, they repeat the same textures, enemies, and environmental set dressing constantly, but it has a distinct look that's charming to me in a crude, grungy sort of way. I grew up playing the Nintendo 64 as a kid, and ever since then, I've always really liked the low poly look games on that console had. And the same goes for 3D games on the Nintendo DS, like Mario Kart, Metroid Prime Hunters, or this game. You can call it nostalgia, but I call it an acquired taste, and it's one that brings a smile to my face whenever I see it replicated in newer games. Taking a second to discuss the music, it's serviceable for the creepy tone the game is going for. It's nothing that'll really stick with you outside of playing the game, and there are a couple of tracks that sound goofy, for lack of a better term, but it adds to the charm of Dementium, and it never became something that drastically took me out of the experience. Honestly, Dementium's vibes is its greatest strength. The low poly look combined with its crunchy music and sound effects really draw the player into its world, despite the story being almost non-existent. There's a sense of dread and despair from the moment the game begins all the way to the end that could have easily been lost along the way had the designers not nailed certain aspects of the game's presentation. So after all is said and done, what are my overall thoughts on Dementium The Ward Remastered? Well, if I'm being completely honest, I didn't have that great of a time with this revisit. There's just too many negatives holding this game back for me. The story is almost non-existent, and there's virtually no stakes to it. The look and feel of the hospital, while distinct, has very few environments that stand out from one another, with rare exceptions like the courtyard or the church areas, for example. The combat might also be serviceable, but you'll sometimes struggle with the mediocre hit detection, and the weapons don't feel that unique from one another. And like the level design, you'll quickly notice how repetitive combat is as well. And for every positive this game has, I can point to another game in the same genre that does it better and for the same asking price of $20 or even less in some cases, depending on where you look. There are some things Dementium does well, but it never does anything exceptionally well. If I had to use a single word to describe Dementium The Ward, it would be mediocre, and it pains me to say that. As I said near the beginning of this video, I grew up playing the original release on Nintendo DS, and I still have a soft spot for it despite the glaring issues. I think it's also important to bring up yet again just how innovative this game was back in 2007 on that handheld. It pushed the boundaries of what a survival horror game could be on the DS, and even in 2025, it still stands out among the DS's vast library of games. But by 2025 standards, as a standalone game and as a remaster no less, it just doesn't hold up at all, and I can't recommend it, unfortunately. At least not for $20. $30 was more than fine to pay for the original game back in 2007 when it was a title ahead of the curve, but $20 for the remaster in present day is unacceptable in my opinion. If you're really interested in this game and are determined to pick it up, do what I did and wait for it to go on sale for $10 or less. I forgot to mention it earlier, but the game is short and can be beaten in around the 3-hour mark for your first playthrough. Normally I don't like to consider a game's length to be a factor in if you should pick it up or not, but with all of the game's problems I talked about in this review, I figured it's worth highlighting. If I had to give Dementium The Ward Remastered a score, I'd say it's a 4 out of 10. There's just too many negatives holding it back, unfortunately. This game will always be remembered for how innovative it was for a DS title when it released in 2007, but as a 2025 title, there are far better survival horror games for you to spend $20 on. Sometimes this sort of thing happens when revisiting games from your adolescence. Occasionally, you'll rediscover a title that still holds up, and other times you'll find one that just doesn't. And when it comes to Dementium, it sits in the latter camp, unfortunately. This is actually a prime example of a game that desperately needs a modern remake to iron out all the flaws and kinks. Maybe one day that'll happen. A port of Dementium Remastered did just get announced for Steam recently. Maybe if it sells well enough, there's a chance for a remake. I still wouldn't recommend paying $20 or more for it, but if you're a diehard survival horror fan and it goes on sale, maybe give it a chance. Despite this revisit souring the experience a little, the memories I have with this title are anything but a demented nightmare, and I'm glad I picked it back up again for another playthrough. So there we have it, Dementium The Ward Remastered. But what do you guys think? Did this review pique your interest in the game, or does it seem like a skip? Have any of you played it recently, or perhaps you played it back in the day? Let me know how you guys are feeling about Dementium The Ward in the comments down below. Until the next video, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.